Some stories shake the music world with noise, others move silently slow, quiet, and almost dull until one day people look back and wonder how such a gentle tragedy was unfolding right in front of them. At 73, the story of George Strait is loud. It's not dramatic, it's not even exciting, but sometimes the saddest stories are the ones where nothing happens and everything slowly fades away. George Harvey Strait, often called the king of country, lived a life many musicians could only dream of. But the strange thing about his journey, especially as he reached 73, was how uneventful and unusually quiet everything seemed. There were no huge scandals, no explosive breakdowns, no shocking public events. Instead, his tragedy unfolded in the least interesting way possible, slowly, gently, and almost invisibly. For decades, George had been a symbol of traditional country music. He released hit after hit, always appearing calm, composed, and emotionally steady. Fans admired him, critics respected him, and his fellow musicians often described him as the kind of artist whose stability made him appear almost unshakable. But as time passed, the world around him began to change quickly, dramatically, and in ways that left George feeling increasingly isolated. At 73, the music landscape was nothing like the era George Strait dominated. Country music had shifted into pop-inspired beats, electronic tones, and high-energy collaborations. Streaming platforms pushed fast trends. Younger artists focused on flashy visuals, social media battles, and viral content. The quiet, traditional style George had built his legacy on no longer fit the modern machine for someone else. This might have sparked outrage, frustration, or public complaints. But George was different. His response was understated to the point of being almost boring. He simply continued doing what he always did, performing occasionally, recording when he felt like it, and avoiding nearly everything that could cause attention. But behind this calmness was a quieter, heavier truth. George was slowly realizing that the world he once shaped no longer needed him in the same way. His shows had loyal audiences, but the broader culture overlooked him more and more each year. Awards shifted toward newer faces. Headlines focused on younger stars, and online conversations rarely mentioned the man who had once defined the genre. As George watched the industry evolve, he found himself caught in a strange space, respected but not relevant, admired but not followed, remembered but not discussed. And unlike the dramatic crises that often hit celebrities, his struggle was subtle. It didn't explode, it simply accumulated. There were evenings where George would sit quietly in his Texas ranch house, watching the sun lower itself behind the fence line. The silence was peaceful, but also heavy. He wasn't sad in a dramatic way, just contemplative.
Almost detached. And that was the essence of this particular tragedy. It wasn't chaotic. It wasn't loud. It wasn't shocking. It was slow, steady, and quietly heartbreaking. Fans who grew up with his music noticed it too. Comment sections on older videos began filling with nostalgic messages like, "They don't make music like this anymore," or "I miss this era," or "Why doesn't anyone talk about him these days?" But nostalgia is a gentle emotion, sweet, soft, and powerless to change anything. George, being the private and understated man he always was, didn't run interviews complaining about this shift. He didn't try to reinvent himself. He didn't chase trends. Instead, he faded gracefully to gracefully, some would say. Because sometimes fading to quietly can feel more tragic than falling loudly. His concerts became less frequent. His public appearances became rare. And slowly, without most people even noticing, George Strait drifted into a kind of stillness. Not retirement. Not disappearance. Just quiet. A long, steady quiet. The tragedy was not a single event, not a health crisis, not a scandal. It was the slow realization that time changes everything and that even legends can be brushed aside by speed, modernity, and algorithms. And yet, as uneventful as his days became, George continued to hold on to something deeply personal, his attachment to music. Not for fame, not for charts, not for headlines, but simply for the calming, grounding feeling of singing songs that felt like home. In many ways, this was the beginning of the heartbreaking part of his life, not because anything terrible happened, but because he remained the same while everything else moved on without him. And sometimes that's the saddest kind of story.
Part 1 was about George quietly drifting away from the fast-changing music world. Then Part 2 is about the even quieter reality he faced once the world truly moved on. It didn't happen suddenly. There was no single day where everything changed. It was gradual, so slow that even George himself didn't fully notice at first. What began as a gentle fading became an everyday silence. George's phone, once constantly buzzing with show offers, award invitations, and media requests, settled into a predictable pattern: long periods of nothing, punctuated by the occasional message from an old friend or a respectful request for an interview he would politely decline. He didn't reject these opportunities because he was upset, he simply felt they didn't matter anymore. The world had shifted, the pace was different, and George felt strangely out of place trying to keep up. On most days, the stillness didn't bother him. He enjoyed his routine. He woke up early, walked around his ranch, checked on the land, and sometimes sat on his porch with a cup of coffee. The Texas air had a way of filling the quiet spaces around him. The breeze moved slowly through the grass, much like the rhythm of his later years, steady, calm, and complicated. But there were moments, small, almost invisible moments, where the weight of that quietness felt different. He'd look at his old guitars, sitting neatly on their stands, and wonder why he didn't pick them up as often as he used to. He'd flip through old notebooks filled with lyrics and ideas, many of them never recorded, and feel a gentle ache of time slipping past. These weren't dramatic emotions. There were no sudden breakdowns, no tearful confessions, just a soft, lonely awareness that the world he once lived in existed mostly in memories now. Occasionally, he'd try to reconnect with it, not in a grand way, but in small efforts like driving into town to see a show from a younger artist or listening to the latest country radio hits. But each time, he felt the same quiet disconnect. The music was good, talented, and polished, but it didn't speak to the same world he came from. The storytelling was different, the priorities were different, and he felt like a visitor in a place he once helped build. What made it tragic wasn't that the world forgot him entirely, far from it. His lifelong fans still adored him. His influence was taught in music courses. New artists still mention him as a legend. But influence is not the same as presence, and admiration is not the same as belonging. George Strait existed in that lonely middle space, honored in the past, respected in the present, but not really part of it anymore. His concerts, when he did agree to perform, had a strange feeling to them. The audience was enthusiastic, loyal, and emotional, but George could feel the difference. Many came for nostalgia, not newness. They came to remember, not rediscover, and while there was beauty in that, there was also a quiet sadness.
Nostalgia is sweet, but it always looks backward, never forward. His band noticed it too. Rehearsals were shorter. George spoke less. The spark was still there, but dimmer, functioning more out of habit than passion. The music wasn't worse, it was simply more measured, more careful, more slow. The energy that once filled arenas felt like an echo now, fading a little more with each performance. One evening, after a particularly still rehearsal, George sat alone in the venue long after everyone had left. He looked out over the empty seats, rows and rows of quiet space, gently illuminated by dim overhead lights. There was something strangely comforting about the emptiness. It felt honest, almost peaceful, and yet, there was an unmistakable heaviness in it too. He didn't cry. He didn't feel broken. He just felt distant. George was not battling chaos. He was battling time itself. And time, as always, moved quietly, so quietly that most people didn't even notice the shift until it was too late. Back at home, his life returned to the same slow routine. The newspapers on his kitchen table would occasionally feature articles about rising country stars. Award shows announced new nominees, new winners, new categories. George would skim through them with mild interest. He wasn't jealous. He just felt like a person flipping through a book he no longer had a chapter in. There were also the quiet reminders of age. Nothing dramatic, just the gentle limits of a body that had carried decades of performances, tours, and travel. He moved slower. He tired more easily. His voice, while still recognizable and strong, carried a softness that hadn't been there before. Fans called it soulful. George called it time. He tried to write again, picking up a notebook late at night when the ranch was fully silent. But the words came slower now, not because he lacked inspiration, but because the world he used to write for didn't feel like it was listening. Not in a cruel way, just in a natural, inevitable way. The tragedy, if it could be called that, wasn't in any one event. It was in the accumulation of ordinary days, each slightly quieter than the last. It was in the gentle fading of relevance, the soft retreat from a world that no longer matched the rhythm of his life. It was in the stillness that wrapped around him, never harsh, never painful, just steadily present. And the most heartbreaking part? George never complained, never fought it, never tried to rewrite the story. He simply lived it, day by day, with the same calm acceptance that had defined his entire life. The legend was still there, the music was still there, but the world had moved on to faster songs, higher tempos, louder stories, and George Strait remained, steady and silent, watching it all drift by like a slow Texas sunset.